I'm so happy to be here today. I'm so happy to be able to present Dr. Shirinyan, who's going to present a really wonderful presentation to you today on autism spectrum disorders, so I'm excited about that. I wanted to tell you a little bit about a couple things that have been going on with our office and on campus. We have been the recipients of a student mental health grant that we're now in our second year of. It's allowed us some extra monies to provide more events on campus, such as this one. We also will have a Mental Health Awareness Week coming up. It'll be the third week in May, I believe. You'll definitely get flyers and email announcements about that as we get closer. We call it Be Kind to Your Mind, so look out for that one. That'll be coming up in May. We're calling this our Student Mental Health Awareness Day today, which is what allowed us to do this presentation, as I said. The grant has also allowed us to provide the online training tool, which our students from the Psych Club were telling you about earlier, so that please take advantage of that. It's free to the campus this year. It won't be free after this year. So I'm not going to spend too much time on me because I want to turn it over to Dr. David Shirinyan, who is, if you don't already know him, he's one of our psychology professors with a specialty in neuroscience. He's wonderful. I've seen him present before. I know you guys are going to really enjoy it. So thank you very much for being here.
No pressure. Okay, so let's get... Actually, let me see. Can you guys hear me if I talk here?
No, well.
I'm usually pretty mobile, but I'll try to stay still. Okay, so I am presenting on autism. This is kind of an unusual talk for me because I'm trying to do two things at once. I would prefer to just present on the second half, which is just brains and neuroscience research. But a few months ago, the field of psychiatry came out with a new manual. And this manual really changed the entire conceptualization of autism. In fact, now called autism spectrum disorder. So I felt a need to sort of update people on that because the changes are pretty huge, pretty significant. Okay, so I'll do that. We'll talk about what the DSM-5 means for autism, how it's conceptualized, the diagnostic criteria, and I'll speculate, because it just came out, we don't actually know the full impact of the changes, but I'll speculate a little bit on what might happen. Then I'll get to the part I really like, which is I'll present 4 studies that have been trying to associate specific symptoms of autism or specific characteristics of autism with brain. Then hopefully I'll have time to talk a brief bit about treatment. All right, so the DSM is a Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Mental Disorders. It's put out by the American Psychiatric Association. Just came out with their 5th edition. Now, this is seen as a changing living document. And the changes that come about in the DSM tend to come from the following things. Societal norms, what we consider to be normal and outside the normal range, shifts and adjusts over time. For example, the most famous example is homosexuality. In the early edition, this was considered a mental disorder. And obviously, that's long gone. What you see sometimes, and I think you guys might think ADHD fits this category, is that certain conditions tend to be overdiagnosed or underdiagnosed. So what the field will do is they'll go and they'll tweak and modify the criteria to try to adjust for that. Okay? I think there's a couple of seats. Right, and the most important reason that the diagnostic criteria change is this last point. New research and findings about the cause of mental illness, the course of mental illness, and the treatment for mental illness. And as new information is coming out, it reaches sort of a critical mass, where the field decides we need a new manual. So in May, the DSM-5 came out, and everyone had to shell out $200 to get this manual, because it really is the, I don't like that term Bible, but it's our reference for mental illness. There's really nothing else that's used or respected as much. There were very significant changes, both in the general organization of the manual and in specific disorders. And I'd say the largest changes were in autism. The entire range of this disorder was reconceptualized. So let's see what happened. Okay, so first of all, just some general background on what autism is. I know people come from different backgrounds. So generally, this is my definition. It's a developmental disorder characterized by deficits and excesses of a range of behaviors, motivations, and interests, and it appears very early on. Now, it's diagnosed typically at around age 2, but the latest research is showing that you can see it at 6 months. If you look really, really hard, you can diagnose that early. By the way, at that point, it's joint attention. This is the process of if I say, oh, look at that, and I'll try to get your attention and get you to look where I'm looking. That sort of ability or that engagement is lacking. Or, oh, isn't this funny, and we both laugh together. All right, so the most common issues, and maybe this should be up top. This is an extremely heterogeneous disorder. It's all over the place. It's very rare to find two people with autism that are identical. So there's a collection of symptoms. The most well-known is this reduced capacity and reduced need for social reciprocity. This back and forth give and take. I hug you, you hug me, we feel happy. There's just this reduced engagement in those kinds of behaviors. There's difficulty in verbal and nonverbal communication, particularly in the social domain. You like this?
No. You can't take notes. We can't take notes.
I don't know.
What if people are writing?
Do they turn on half? Turn off half?
Perfect.
There we go.
Oh, come on.
Turn off the front, leave the back. It's not possible.
I'm going to try one last time.
All I want.
Go back.
It's all automated, I can't help you. Oh, this is creepy. Well, it's good for Halloween, I guess. All right, so difficulty in verbal and nonverbal communication. A really good example of the nonverbal communication is imagine elevator behavior. If you're the only one in the elevator, you stand basically wherever you want. If a second person comes in, they generally do a polar opposite of where you are. It's like the dots on dice. Generally, people stay far away from each other. And you generally face forward. If you're the only one in the elevator and someone walks on and they come face the back and stand right next to you, that's unusual. So that's an extreme example, but we have a lot of social behaviors that are extremely interactive but are nonverbal. People with autism have repetitive behaviors, such as body rocking, hand flapping, clapping, etc. Let's actually watch some pretty severe cases of autism exhibiting repetitive behavior. Maybe not.
David, maybe in Firefox.
Yeah.
You just copy and paste the URL.
It's a hyperlink, so give me a second. No one uses this.
Autistic individuals are extremely isolated. They rarely interact with
Oh, technology.
Autistic individuals are extremely isolated. They rarely interact with others and lack many social and self-help skills. Autistic children rarely play appropriately with toys. They use objects for simple sensory feedback or self-stimulation. Repetitive behaviors, such as body rocking, are also self-stimulatory.
So they'll do these things over and over and over repeatedly as though they can't stop. They also have quite restricted or fixated set of interests. They will be really into one or two or three topics, and they'll want to talk about those, want to play with those specific things, but not much else. It's to the exclusion of everything else. And we'll take a look at this some more later. So there's a profound need for sameness in people with autism. And if you change their need for sameness, sometimes they react really, basically a tantrum. Okay, and it's coming from their inability to communicate their needs, to tell you how much they need that sameness. Something that's newly added to the diagnosis is there's an extreme sensitivity to particular sensory information. One of the examples Lovas told us back in the day is there was a child who was completely fine unless you were opening candy wrappers. Something about the candy wrapper crinkling and tearing would really upset the boy. So certain sensory inputs are experienced really intensely. And unfortunately, especially on the severe end, there's a tendency for self-injurious behavior. Now, I wasn't sure whether I should show this or not, because it's a little bit disturbing. But it really is the face of severe autism. So I felt you guys are adults, you can handle it. Let's look at this one. And I'd urge you to resist the judgment of the mother and the parents in this video. It's extremely difficult when you're dealing with a child who's injuring themselves. How they deal with it, I certainly wouldn't recommend, but try to reserve judgment. I'm more interested in you seeing the behavior.
No.
Hi, Joey.
Hi. Ain't you about to?
Louis. I'm Louis.
Painted. Hi, Louis.
If you could take the autism away, would you do it?
Yes, I always pray for that miracle. And one day I was in church and my daughter says, "Mom, do you know that God made him that way?" So then I'm like, God made him that way to make me learn a lesson, probably. Hi, Kate. Say hi.
Carol's daughter
Say hi.
Kate
How was
is
school?
not autistic.
Oh, hi, Kate.
You don't want to say hi, you're being shy?
That's okay.
I'm just gonna bring her in. Down, 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 down.
trying to get him in a position where he won't hurt himself. Beyond that, they don't do it right, so I won't even show it. But you know, this is what happens. It's really challenging if you have a child with severe autism. And hopefully I'll get to talk about this later. One thing that really worries me is what's going to happen when these folks grow up and funding and services dry up. Because current law provides that the state has to provide services until about age 21. After that, they're basically on their own. Okay, so the DSM-5 has now created a new diagnosis called autism spectrum disorder. This encompasses 4 previous diagnoses from the previous DSM. So autistic disorder is gone, Asperger's is gone, childhood disintegrative disorder is a specifier, and there was this catch-all that we had in DSM-4 that was pervasive developmental disorder, where people didn't quite fit the classic other diagnoses, but they clearly had a pervasive developmental disorder. These are also gone. So now there's an autism spectrum disorder diagnosis. Symptoms now must be present before age 5, which wasn't the case before. And the APA claims that this is so that it'll encourage parents and pediatricians to diagnose it earlier. And what's really great now is you can diagnose autism based on historical evidence. Because a lot of times what happens is a child, you won't notice a child's limitations, especially if they're very high functioning, until their demands get higher. So social demands get much higher once you enter elementary school. It might be that you never notice social deficits until the demands sort of superseded the capacity of the child. So you can say, you know, in retrospect, there were some subtleties that we didn't notice before. And now they added a new diagnosis, which is, I think, problematic, called social communication disorder. Pragmatic, so yeah, the practical use of communication. We'll talk about this. It worries me because I don't think these kids are going to get services. Okay, so ASD is seen as having 2 primary domains. Persistent deficits in social communication and social interaction. And to meet this criteria, you got to have all of the following 3. Deficits in social emotional back and forth reciprocity. Deficits in nonverbal communicative behaviors used for social interaction. And you can see examples for mild, moderate, and severe cases. And deficits in developing, maintaining, and understanding relationships. So you need to meet criteria for all 3 of these. The second domain is this restricted, repetitive pattern of behavior, interests, and activities. And for this, you need to have 2 of these 4 in order to meet criteria for autism spectrum disorder. Stereotyped or repetitive motor movements, use of objects in repetitive ways, like lining up toys, lining up Lego blocks in a long line rather than building with them, for example. Insistence on sameness, inflexible adherence to routines, or ritualized patterns of verbal or nonverbal behavior. Highly restricted, fixated interests that are abnormal, either in intensity or focus. So it's either an abnormal thing for a typical person to be very into, like washing machine parts, or the intensity is unusual. So all kids, well, many kids like trains, but there are levels of liking trains. There are typical kids who like trains, will draw them, will collect them. But if that's all you ever want to talk about, and all you want to look at when you go online are trains, this is now to the exclusion of other developmental growth, so that would be a problem. And this is new, and I'm so glad they finally put it in. I don't know why it's in this category, but whatever, it's in. Hyper or hypoactivity, hyporeactivity to sensory input,
or unusual interest in sensory aspects of the environment. Or unusual interest in sensory aspects of the environment. So being really into textures, touching, all the buildings on campus to see just how they feel. Or excessive sensitivity to sound. Or you get a lot of children who are extremely bothered if their clothes don't line up just right. Okay? So this is now a diagnostic criteria. There are now a lot of specifiers in the DSM-5. So you get the diagnosis, then it's like with or without such and such, with or without such and such. For ASD, the first specifier is how severe is it? And this also freaks me out a little bit. We'll talk about why. For ASD, there are 3 levels of severity, and it's based on how much support the person needs to get by. So requiring some support is the mildest level. Requiring substantial support, level 2. Requiring very substantial support is level 3. I'm just worried about the reliability of these ratings, because I'm sure of funding for services is going to be based on what level you're at. And if the rating itself is not very solid, then a lot of kids are going to miss out on services they actually need. Then you need to specify if there's a known genetic or medical condition that's contributing to the autism, to the ASD. Then you need to note if there's a specific language impairment. In the last DSM, this was actually part of the autism diagnosis, but it's taken out. Now it's all about social communication and repetitive behavior. And finally, you need to note whether there's intellectual impairment. This used to be called mental retardation. That term is taken out because it's clearly stigmatized and people use it so derogatorily, so they just took it out. Now it's intellectual impairment. Because a large portion of autistic individuals do have intellectual impairment, but many have normal and far above normal intellectual functioning. This is essentially, to keep it simple, like the ASD diagnosis without any of the repetitive behavior fixated interest component. And this concerns me, and the APA and the autism advocates are really interested in what's happening with this diagnosis, because school districts are strapped for cash. And I understand if there's a way that they can reduce the number of people they need to serve, they're going to do it. And I just seriously doubt that they're going to fund this the way they would fund an ASD diagnosis. So potential impact of the changes. Again, this is potential. My educated guess. Maybe I'm being a little too paranoid, but probably not. So for existing people who have an existing diagnosis, established DSM-4 diagnosis, nothing changes. You maintain your Asperger's diagnosis or whatever it was for the rest of your life. So that's great. But it's for newly diagnosed individuals that things are going to change. And it seems like, even though the APA claims that the rates shouldn't change, their own research tells me that the rates will change. And this is the best case scenario. This study showed that using DSM-5 criteria on people who were diagnosed with DSM-4, you get 91% concordance. But that's the best case scenario. There are other studies that show it's much worse. So it looks like there are going to be less kids diagnosed with autism spectrum disorders. Now, I guess this depends on whether you thought ASD was overdiagnosed or not, but most people I've talked to don't feel that that is the case. So the fear is that we're going to lose a lot of kids. They're going to go undiagnosed because of this new method. I already talked about the next one. And I worry about the stigma. Because previously when we had diagnoses like Asperger's or PDD-NOS, where most people didn't even know what that is, stigma level was significantly lower than if you had autism, plain and simple. Now with everyone being called autism spectrum disorder, I worry that that'll have a chilling effect on families' willingness to get their kids evaluated and on people's willingness to address their needs.
Maybe it's unfounded, but I do worry about that. Okay. Now, let's talk about some brain research. So for about 20 years, we've been doing a lot of brain imaging using functional magnetic resonance imaging. In the last 10 years, people like my previous mentor figured out how to scan kids with autism. Because when you look at an MRI scanner, this is really scary. You have to lay down here. Your head is where that water bottle thing is. And then the machine goes in and you go into about your waist into the magnet bore. Not only that, but you have to stay there for about 1 hour to 90 minutes. Not only that, but you have to stay perfectly still, or else the images are useless. So it took a lot of tweaking and caressing and a lot of practice sessions to get kids finally capable of withstanding the stresses of this machine. Well, you don't even know how it sounds. Oh my goodness, it's insanely loud. Insanely loud. You have to wear earplugs and noise-canceling headphones just to be allowed into the scanner room. So there were a lot of challenges. The stuff that really interests me is when the studies are trying to link brain differences between typical children and ASD children to symptoms, to specific domains of autism. Because now we're starting to see how people with autism use their brains differently. How exactly they accomplish the things that they do. Because it is these differences that are going to be at the heart of the disorder. I'll talk about 4 such studies. 2 that were mine and 2 from other labs. Okay, so the way fMRI works is it detects oxygenation of brain tissue. You put people in there, you have them do various computer tasks that demand certain things from different parts of the brain. See guys, generally the more demand you put on an area of brain, the more oxygen is going to rush to that area of brain. The more oxygen we see in an area, we can then say pretty accurately that that area was more active. Okay, so we're measuring oxygenation changes. Then we can make beautiful color maps, and we can say this was certainly a visual task, because the visual system is activated. This is a spatial, probably working memory task. You've got frontal lobe and parietal and visual. So you make color maps, and you make assertions about what you're finding to be. Let's take avoidance of eye contact. This is one of the cardinal features of autism. Typically speaking, especially people who have not had a lot of intervention, are not very good at maintaining and sustaining and initiating and actually stopping eye contact. What you see most of the time when you start doing treatment for eye contact is you'll have kids who just don't disengage the eye contact, and that can get a little disconcerting. So you have to teach them when to disengage as well. But anyway, there's an avoidance of eye contact. So people have been wondering why. What is going on here? Because eye contact is such a critical component of social communication. Not only do you make relationships with eye contact, but you also learn from other people's gaze. It's a very important learning tool. Well, we have a part of the brain deep within called the amygdala. And in an overly simplified way, you could call it the brain's alarm system. But actually, we've learned a lot in the last 10 years about amygdala. And it's not just alarm. The amygdala seems to respond whenever there's something emotionally meaningful in the environment. Whenever there's something emotionally relevant, such as an attractive person, a family member, a smiling face, police lights, an angry dog, whatever the case is. And for humans, any human face triggers activation of the amygdala. So for a long time, people have been comparing the amygdala of people with autism and typical people. This study is one of my all-time favorites, Dalton in 2005, because along with the fMRI, they did eye tracking. They could tell exactly what the people were looking at, when they were looking, how long they were looking. They had two studies. The details I'm going to skip because that would take too much time. But one was a direction of gaze analysis. This, they're looking right at you. This, they're looking away. And this one is indicating some kind of threat off to the right. This, they had familiar faces, so maybe a family member or a friend or a classmate, and matched, blonde, about the same age kid, but unfamiliar. Here's what they found. The only difference in eye gaze, the only difference was that children with autism avoided looking at the eyes of the people. So amount of time spent on the face was lower, but not significantly. Amount of time spent on the mouth was about the same. But amount of time spent on the eyes was the only thing that was different. And this was consistent in both studies. Now, other researchers who didn't do eye tracking had found, hey, the amygdala in autism isn't working. It's not activating. But what I love this study is they did that eye tracking. When you look at just the times when the autistic individuals are looking at the eyes, you see that the amygdala is overactive. So this tells you potentially that children with autism have an aversion to looking at the eyes, that they might get a startled response, that they get hyper-aroused. If something consistently startles you, why would you keep looking at it? Right? Does that make sense? Now the good news as a behaviorist is that you can train this down. You could train it by having the child repeatedly and consistently look at eyes. You can reduce this hyperactivity of the amygdala. Next up, this is sensory over-responsivity. This is the sensitivity to sensory stimuli. So it's an extreme negative response to, or straight up avoidance of sensory stimuli, such as the following. Now, up to 70% of children with ASD meet criteria for this, which is a lot. And having sensory over-responsivity is associated with low levels of social and adaptive skills, negative emotion, and anxiety. And thankfully, it's finally included in the diagnosis. This is one of my studies. We presented white noise, so like shh, as the auditory stimulus. We presented this was a moving, flashing color wheel as visual stimulus. Then we had a condition where you had both vision and auditory. Now the bottom line is that when you look at typically developing kids versus autistic kids, what you see is that the kids with autism have overactive sensory system. Their auditory cortex, which processes hearing, and their visual cortex, which processes vision, is much more active compared to the typical kids. What really drove it home for me is we had measures of sensory over-responsivity. And what we found is that depending on how severe your sensory over-responsivity was, that correlated with activation of these areas and activation of the amygdala. Okay, so what we're seeing is that children who experience sensory over-responsivity have associated with it, now this is correlation, it's not causation, have associated sensory overactivity in auditory and visual cortex and amygdala overreactivity. There's little reason that this white noise and flashing flicker should trigger amygdala activity in a typical person without SOR. It turns out if it bothers you, right along with it you have the amygdala overactive. Now, reduce social reciprocity. Now, this is often the most distressing symptom that parents will talk to you about. Let me just check on time. Good. A parent once told me, sometimes he treats me like a piece of furniture, like I'm not even there. And this is very hurtful and painful to the parent. Well, humans have a very robust reward system. It's there to keep us motivated to do things that are good for you and that are good for your species. Like have sex, eat, spend time together, take care of your familiar kin, and so on and so forth. Now, of course, drugs hijack this system and it goes all crazy, but that was my last talk. So the human reward system is something that we definitely want to look into. Because the human reward system is highly activated when we see smiling faces. And that makes a lot of sense, right? We're an extremely social animal. We depend on each other, we need each other. So it makes sense that if I can get you to smile, that should make me feel good, because whatever's happening is good. We're strengthening our relationship, that increases chances that you're going to help me out, that I'm going to help you out. So it makes sense. Well, I think you know where I'm going with this. Van Zeeland et al. Found that during fMRI, children with autism did not activate their reward system. This is typical developing kids. You see, their ventral striatum, which includes parts of the reward system, is highly activated by both monetary rewards and social rewards. And most important for this talk is the social rewards component. Kids with autism fail to activate the reward system, both the monetary rewards, which doesn't surprise me too much, but the social rewards one, that's the one that's more problematic. Okay. I love this study. Now, people who work with kids with autism know this pretty well. It's sort of obvious. For a long time, I worked with kids with autism, and this is one of the stimuli. We had a reward. We found that this kid, I blurred out his face so you can't see him, he liked to be squeezed, as a lot of people with autism do. This feeling of compression is very calming to them. Well, we learned that he liked it, so we started to use it as a reward. So we called it squeeze, and whenever he wanted to squeeze, he would have to work for it, doing certain behavioral tasks. And I'm so glad I still have this, because I missed the guy. This is the last kid I got to work with before I had to move on. Okay, finally, restricted and or fixated interests. So people with ASD have this small set of things that they're into. Sometimes it's just one thing. And again, the problem is that this is to the exclusion of other things, typically to the exclusion of social engagement. They're highly motivated by this thing, which is quite interesting. They'll fight for it, they'll work for it. If you take it away, they will not be happy. So I had people come in. I asked the kids to self-select a non-social but highly salient reward. So the kids identified this with me and with the parents. I had to make sure the parents were okay with it, of course. Here are some actual examples that they picked. Then I had the kids rate, and importantly, the typically developing kids and the ASD kids were both equally excited about their prize. So they picked the prize ahead of time, that they were going to do my study and try to earn that prize. Here's what I found. The reward system is hyperactive in autism to non-social rewards. We saw in the previous study that it was underactive to social rewards. We see here that it's quite overactive to non-social rewards. So the reward system is becoming more and more a very interesting system to study in autism. So now we've talked about amygdala. We've talked about primary sensory systems. And those of you in my classes, the thalamus is also overactive in these kids, if you remember what the thalamus does. Now the reward system is, you can't just call it abnormal, but it responds to certain things but not others, probably to the detriment of the kid. let's talk a bit about treatment. So I was trained by the behavior god of autism, Lobos, and I really believe in that approach. He's the man. Well, he was the man. He passed away, unfortunately. But he came up with use of applied behavioral analysis for autism. ABA had been around for other things, but he really, not perfected, but he originated the treatment for autism. This treatment is intense. When I tell people, they're sort of confused. It's 40 hours a week, ideally, of one-on-one work with the kids. Now just imagine how expensive this is. Because you need a team of at least 3 individuals. Because there's no way one person can handle working with one autistic child for 40 hours a week. There's, people who do this kind of work, not to pat myself in the back, but they're gifted with patience and compassion for these kids. But you can burn out really fast. So most companies have you work with like 3 or 4 kids at a time. You go here one day, here another day, so that you don't burn out. So you need a team of 3 or 4 individuals. And that's quite expensive. But let's look at this. This is an example of really good ABA, at least according to me.
What do you want to work for today?
Magnets.
The magnets. All right, we are working for magnets.
So he picked a reward. And you see it's typically non-social. It's going to be something that he's really into at that time or generally. But you have a prize, and you're going to now try to get the child to work as hard as he can to achieve that prize.
Good job. Good job doing this. Very nice. All right. Wow, very nice. Good job doing this. All right. What does this one say? No, it says when.
When?
Yeah, when.
When?
So he was building up momentum by doing a couple of really easy things, like do this, just trying to get the kid some success, and then he brought out a reading task that's really hard for him. And you see, he didn't berate him for getting it wrong. He's working with him, it's encouraging, it's positive. And I think this guy is really, truly gifted.
Good job. All right. What about this one? What does this say?
But.
It does say but. Good job. Give me 5. Good job. Okay.
You see the trouble with reciprocity? It was extremely delayed and not really that natural.
What does this one say?
It
It says eat.
Eat. Oh.
Yeah, eat.
Oh.
All right. What about this one? What does it say?
Up.
It does say up. Good job. Nice reading. Oh, very nice. And what about this one?
When?
Made.
Oh, made.
Yeah, made. You got it. Good job. Okay. What does this one say?
In.
It does say in. You got it. All right.
In.
The only thing I would do differently is use more social rewards, like more high fives and maybe ruffle his hair a little bit more, a little hug or something, just to get him, more rewarded by social things. Anyway, that's ABA. It takes a lot of work. You have to sort of approach the problem from 100 different angles at a time. This was just one little program, they call it, one little session in reading. But they have 100 of them in all sorts of skills, whatever level the child is in. Some kids, the biggest goal we had for one of our kids was to get him to be able to make the bed. Not because the mom couldn't do it, but you just want the child to feel mastery over their life. And that was a huge thing when we finally got there. But these kids grow up. and especially the people on the more severe end. It's one thing when you have a 7-year-old. It's another thing when you have a 220-pound grown man who's doing self-injurious or self-destructive behavior. And also, by the way, there are, as you could imagine, significant challenges when they hit puberty, because they discover their sexuality. So what happens when these people become adults? We've diagnosed so many kids with autism that are going to become adults pretty soon.
Little kids are the public face of autism. Their appeal helping to win public understanding and educational support. At the age of 3, Zach Hamrick was admitted to the School for Children with Autism in Paramus, New Jersey, run by Bridget Taylor. Although it's a private school, the fees are mostly covered by public funds.
When Zach came to Alpine Learning Group 18 years ago, he had very limited language and couldn't follow directions. It was very difficult to engage socially. And here on the tape, what you see is I'm asking him questions, and he only knows answers to very few questions, and he can't really attend to our conversational interactions for long periods of time. Will you jump?
But when children like Zach grow up, will there be public support for them as adults when they're no longer cute, harmless, and unthreatening? In 2 months, Zach will turn 21, and the federally subsidized education that has brought him this far will end.
What numbers are these?
5, 8, 4.
The mandate that made education available to all children regardless is a cruel paradox of impressive skills compromised by serious handicaps. In 2009, Zach completed New York's Nautica Triathlon in 3 hours and 14 minutes. He swam a mile in the Hudson River, biked for 25 miles, and ran for 6 in Central Park. Yet he was never more than a few feet from his father or his cousin, because Zach has no sense of dangers in traffic, and so can't go out on his own.
We come to an intersection, he doesn't know what those cars are going to do when he needs to stop, so he's dependent on my telling him.
Turn right. Zach, go turn left. Turn left again. Go fast. Go. Pass the car. Go. Right side. Go. 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 Pass it. Yeah.
And strangest of all, this expert biker doesn't understand about changing gears.
Do you want to make it easy? Yeah. Make it easy, Zach. All right. Now let's go.
Of course he feels it's easier, but it's not better. Easier is not necessarily better from his perspective. Hard is also good.
There you go.
Good. Zachary can't communicate well enough with people to explain himself or tell them what to do. So the signs on his helmet, in case he gets separated or I get hurt, in order to let people know that he is autistic.
Steve, who's an investment banker, has made a huge personal investment in Zach's physical development. Instead of words, they have a shared physical community.
You like the song?
For hundreds of thousands of adolescents with autism about to become adults, there are very few programs available. For those desperate to find a solution, it is a public health crisis.
Well, estimates are about, 700 to 800,000, kids are moving through this system, and, time is not on our side. These kids are aging at the same rate as all of us. Hey, Elias. What do you have?
Peter Gerhardt is a nationally known expert on adolescents and adults with autism. He directs the program for teenagers at the McCartan School in New York. Gerhardt considers the disabilities education law basically a civil rights issue for children, but not, so far, for adults.
It's really scary. I just don't know what we're going to do. It truly is going to be an epidemic. I don't have any answers, but hopefully one of you will. So finally, what do? Well, try to get involved, try to do what you can. There's this advocacy group, Autism Speaks, and they're just fantastic. They really are. They fund a lot of research. They raise a lot of money and a lot of awareness and attention. If families are having trouble getting services, they will assist them with some legal aid and so on. So they're really great. You can volunteer with them, you could help them out, you could work with them. But as young scholars, one of the best things you can do is, if you're interested, continue your education, become a scientist or a psychologist or a social worker or an occupational therapist or a physical therapist or whatever else, speech therapist, and work with these kids and adults. Let's watch this video. Now there's a little bit of a commercial aspect to it. Ignore that aspect, but it really brings home the idea that it takes a massive number of people to work with these individuals.
Aiden was diagnosed with autism when he was just 2. I knew that something was wrong with him when he wasn't speaking.
He was diagnosed at 18 months. I had no idea what autism was. Wasn't sure what it meant or what we needed to do. Of course, devastated.
I remember thinking a complete stranger has just broken my heart and really shattered what you hope for the future of your child.
That you have all these hopes for their future, that they'll get married, study something in college they love, and have this great happy life, and all of a sudden you're like, oh, I'm not sure what my child will be able to do. I'm not sure my child will ever leave home.
The world goes black and you say nothing's ever going to be the same, and all of your hopes and dreams for that child have been stolen away.
When your child is first diagnosed, there's a waiting list for a waiting list. There's a tremendous amount of pressure to get them into therapy right away, and they say there's this window, and you sign up for everything, and you find out there's a 6-month waiting list for this speech person and 3 months for OT.
Everything you're reading says you've got to get this intervention early, and you can't get in to see the doctor who can start the intervention. I didn't realize the type of help that he was going to need, not just the ABA, but the OT, the PT.
The whole "it takes a village" is definitely something that for us was an understatement.
For Aiden, my oldest son, he's 10 years old, and he has severe autism, and it takes his behaviorist, his speech therapist, his occupational therapist, his physical therapist. Most kids have a wonderful team of teachers, therapists, OT, PT. It takes a lot of people to get the best out of a child with autism. How many is that? At least 10 of us already, and it's constant work all the time.
The people who get involved with people on the spectrum are just such wonderful individuals. They go out of their way to do something special for somebody who really needs their help.
You know, without all those people, Jack would still be nonverbal and disruptive and not eating and escaping our house in the middle of the night.
The amount of people that we've had over the last 7 years come into his life, they've all touched us, they've all touched him, each in their own special way. So I'm very grateful to all those people.
They care about him. They're not just teaching him. They're not just teaching him how to go to the bathroom. They're not just teaching him communication. They're giving him emotional support. They are loving to him, and my son feels that.
In my opinion, I think setting high standards is important. Like, I know that, you know, my guys are, they have a classification of autism, but, you know, that doesn't mean that we're going to let things go, and they're going to have to become productive members of society, whether it be, you know, at 15 years old, 21, 31, they're going to have to do it.
It takes a village to raise any child, but especially within this community,
This is a pretty growing sector for jobs. Even students at your level, well, really once you get your second year under your belt, you can start getting involved with services that do this kind of work. Finally, thank you, and we can take questions if you have any. It's initially and before treatment, they don't respond very well to social rewards.
What's the question?
Sorry. She was saying that I was saying there's a problem with the reward system. However, the guy who was working with the kid was using rewards. Remember, it's social rewards that there's a hypoactivation. But as treatment progresses, one of the main goals is to get them hooked on social rewards, to get them to really like to be hugged or to like it when you stuff their hair. So that's after some time. And also remember, there are kids at all different levels. Some that might not have these reward deficits.
When they become adults, actually the state moved to when they're adults is Pennsylvania. But that's another whole other story. California is a wonderful resource for children toddler up to age 21. In regional centers can help parents a lot with things like resting so that they can maybe get a few hours a week and you have someone come in to help them. They'll provide services like ABA or behavioral intervention at home where maybe the school district won't. So regional center is a really big part of the autistic life.
And it stops at 5, is that right?
Pardon?
Regional centers stop at 5?
Stops never. If you are accepted as a regional center client, you are a regional center client for the rest of your life. When you become an adult and leave school, they are, and there's now a new law, SB 458, that you can, within the regional centers, there are many of them, because California is a really huge place, and not all regional centers do the same things. Some will vendor one place, generally they'll do what's called a courtesy vendorship, and will give you the services that one other regional center has and then provide for. However, and they'll tell you no if they can't provide it, but they're now with SB 458. If you want to find a program for your child and the regional center says no, no longer can they say no. They have to provide and pay for it wherever you want to put them. Like I'll be looking for a program when my son finishes school very soon, and none of the ones they have recommended are really worth anything or fit his needs. So whatever I find, if they tell me no, they can't tell me that anymore. I can never
Thank you.
no longer. Then you're a regional center client forever.
Good, thank you.
The one thing to keep in mind, especially for young people, and I think the point of the discussion is so powerful, is that you get into regional center if you're diagnosed within the early years, in the early elementary years as they're cut off. And that's a little bit of a moving target depending upon the regional center that you're in. But however, one of the big problems, which is very important about the legislation she talked about, one of the dilemmas for a lot of these cases is that they would get into the regional center, David, and then they would be reevaluated because of the treatment. And so you have parents whose children whose verbal abilities improved because of the old Asperger's, and they would be kicked out. So there was this in and out revolving door of good services, not good services. Where I think your point is really taken well, and even though there are regional centers, and she's absolutely right, the quality of care it varies tremendously. And it isn't substantial and comprehensive, which is what I think is very important in your point, is that they do need comprehensive services throughout their lives. And that's a big dilemma. It just isn't at the level that I think you really recognize it needs to be at.
Well, fast forwarding to young adults who come to Santa Monica College, I just want to say on behalf of these students, there are a lot of students on our campus who have autism or Asperger's, the old diagnosis, and they need friends. you might see somebody who seems a little isolated, a little bit odd, who is pretty much on their own, has trouble maybe getting into a group, but becoming a friend might have great rewards for you and even greater rewards for that person that you meet. So maybe the next time you see somebody who has some behaviors that you don't quite, you know that they're not quite the norm, it's possible that they might have autism, which wouldn't be appropriate for you to ask, but you might let your natural curiosity take you over and your compassion and interest in other people and see if you can become a friend or an acquaintance of someone.
Absolutely. It really is so important.
You have to have symptoms before age 5. Yeah. You can be diagnosed later. And that could happen with very high functioning. Like I said, if as the social demands increase, you might only see the deficits once they're really high up. And that could be when they're 6 or 7. But if in retrospect you're like, you know what, absolutely, he had some avoidance of eye contact when he was little, that counts. Well, good luck to you on that one. Because it depends on who's evaluating. Oh, so many people.
Me? So back to what she was saying, like trying to become their friends. What if you try that and they shut you down? Because I've tried that and they don't want to be my friend, so I let them go. Because I've tried that, like I've tried approaching them and being nice, but they don't want to be my friend.
It might also be something like they have trouble with social interaction.
They do have trouble.
Yeah, they do. So how do you deal with that?
You say,
Patience.
well, you say, you know, I just am interested in maybe getting to know you a little better. Maybe we could be friends. You know, or maybe quietly follow them around.
I don't know about that.
If you're nonverbal, it might turn to you and ask you what that is. And there you go. That's the first breakthrough. Sometimes they just don't know how to.
Second to following them around, do you believe in mainstreaming, putting not a stigmatized on autistic children, but put them in groups where they can find friends just because they're in the same room, or they're high functioning and they're working through their difficulties?
As long as they can engage, of course, absolutely.
What did you mean when you said they no longer diagnose you with Asperger's? What would you be considered now, or?
Asperger's would be autism spectrum disorder, probably level 1.
I may be getting the personality disorder wrong. Dr. Navarro, you may know the actual name and the criteria for it, but I think it's called schizoid personality disorder, now a part of the autism spectrum, or is it still considered?
No.
No.
It's part of the schizophrenia spectrum.
No, not, it's, so typal.
Yeah, schizoid then.
Oh, okay. Never mind.
But I understand why you would think it would be. There is more lack of a need for other people. It's not that they don't understand eye contact and social interactions. They'd rather be off than a hill on their own. Yeah. It's not.
Repeat the question.
So she said, you said you can see signs as early as 6 months. Is that for all autistic children? Absolutely not. That's why it's not. That's why most doctors don't know about it, because they're still working on what's called the sensitivity and the specificity. So identifying only autistic individuals and trying to get as many of them as you can. But it's pretty good. It's surprisingly good.
You might not know, but my brother has severe autism, but he used to be verbal up until he was 3, and then it was like day and night where he lost all balance.
Childhood disintegrative disorder, which is normal, 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 normal. It's part of the spectrum.
You mentioned that kids with autism have they have a specialty that they're really into. Could it be in some way beneficial to them if they're really into math or something?
Yes, it can, and this is what, in my opinion, this is why the savant issue is kind of counterproductive, because it's rare when the fixation is truly something beneficial. Like a true fixation on piano, and they'll be just a virtuoso level performer. Unfortunately, most of the time, it's not something that's that quote-unquote functional in our society.
I have worked with autistic children before, and one of the fixations that I saw was this kid who was obsessed with earthquakes. He would come every morning and tell me about what earthquake happened, to what degree it happened. And through the social skills class that he was in, the one that I volunteered, he was able to just put that into the conversation, but not talk only about that. So I think social skills is really important.
Oh yeah.
Well, as a parent for someone who has Asperger's and autism spectrum disorder, what I found with regard to the school district is there seemed to be a very big disconnect in terms to the children and the types of services being provided by the schools. What I mean by that is that unless a student is falling behind by 1 or 2 grade levels of their level of education, they are not provided with the kind of services in either LA Unified or Santa Monica Malibu school districts. No matter where I've taken or asked questions on, depending upon what the school district offers, there may not be the room necessary, they may not have the ability to offer those types of services, whether it be if I'm not living in that area, mind you, a transfer or a permit type of situation. So kind of leaves it to my own resolve to find ways of my own personal funding to pay for out of pocket when, even with the current school is going to at the middle school level, they will not permit him